Welcome to the deep dive. I really appreciate you being here. We're all about getting to the bottom of really cool stuff, right? And today we're going deep, deep, deep into John Irving's A Prayer for Owen Meany.
It's one of those books you can just keep coming back to. There's always something new to discover.
Right. So many layers. Our focus today is on those early chapters, those really formative years of Owen Meany and the narrator, John Wheelwright. We want to see how their lives start to intertwine and really try to unpack the themes and relationships Irving sets up from the very beginning.
It's like we're laying the groundwork, right? Building that foundation so we can understand everything that comes later.
Exactly. So if you've read the book, awesome. If not, no worries. We're here to guide you.
Okay, let's jump right in.
One of the first things that grabs you about Owen Meany is, well, how different he is. He's intense, even as a kid. I mean, even his issues with church are kind of on another level. Like, most kids might complain about being bored or fidgety in those long services.
Yeah, that's pretty standard kid stuff.
Right. But Owen's complaints were different, almost like a theological critique, you know? He famously said, a person's faith goes at its own pace. The trouble with church is the service. It's like he saw this huge disconnect between the hymns and prayers, and especially the sermons. They just didn't resonate with him.
It's so interesting because it goes beyond just a kid being restless. It's a sign of his incredibly strong and personal faith, even at such a young age. He's questioning these established religious structures, looking for something more meaningful.
And it wasn't just church, right? The narrator says Owen was insulted by jokes of any kind. I mean, who's insulted by jokes, right? Especially a kid. And we're talking about a kid who, before he was even 10, was reading a Wall's History of Gravesend and had already finished the entire Bible. I mean, that's some serious dedication.
Oh, absolutely. He's presented as this incredibly precocious and serious child, almost an old soul. And then you have the narrator, John, who's more like your typical kid. He admits he wasn't the best student, and his complaints about church were, pretty standard. Too long, stuffy, boring.
Yeah, the kind of thing all of us probably thought at some point, right?
Totally. And that contrast between Owen and John, it's really important. They see the world in such different ways, and that dynamic, it's going to play out throughout the entire story. It shapes how they relate to each other and how they deal with all the crazy things that happen.
Speaking of crazy things, we have to talk about Gravesend Academy. This was the school, the place to be for boys in their town.
Right, a real symbol of opportunity. Although it's interesting that girls weren't even allowed back then. The narrator even mentions how this affected his mother and Aunt Martha.
Right, they could only be involved indirectly, through the men in their lives.
Exactly, which says a lot about the societal norms of the time. And of course, Owen, being the brilliant student that he is, he's on track to get in on his own merit, maybe even a scholarship. But John's path is different. It's tied to his mother's upcoming marriage to someone on the faculty who eventually adopts him.
So Gravesend Academy becomes this symbol of privilege, social standing even, but then the narrative shifts dramatically with this pivotal event that really defines John's life. The baseball game where his mother is accidentally killed. And the way Irving describes this scene, it's so vivid. John's mother is standing down the left field line beyond third base in this simple white cotton dress and a red scarf, holding up her hair, looking into the stands. And John says everyone was watching her, something he was used to, but this time it felt different, almost like a premonition.
The way Irving uses those visual details, it's so powerful. The white dress, the red scarf, they almost become symbolic. And her position, not even focused on the game and how everyone's attention is drawn to her, it creates this sense of foreboding, like something's about to happen.
Yeah, it's like she becomes this unwitting focal point right before the tragedy, and the moments leading up to the accident are almost excruciatingly slow. The pitcher walks Harry Hoyt, Buzzy Thurston hits a routine grounder, and then out of nowhere, their coach, Mr. Chickering, tells Owen to swing away, which is totally unexpected. Usually, Owen was instructed to take a walk, not even lift the bat.
Right, it's like Mr. Chickering just threw out the rule book.
Exactly. And Owen, small for his age, searches for the tiniest bat he can find. The first pitch is wild. The second nearly hits him. And then there's this small detail that feels so significant. Owen meticulously dusts himself off while his mother's back is to home plate, waving to someone in the stands.
I know what you mean. That detail really stuck with me too. It's such a normal, everyday act in the middle of this unfolding tragedy. And it almost highlights Owen's detachment from the chaos around him, like he's in his own world.
Totally. And then it happens. Owen starts his swing almost before the ball leaves the pitcher's hand. He connects harder than he ever has before. The crack of the bat echoes with this unusually sharp, loud sound. His mother turns her head, drawn by the noise, and at that exact moment, the ball strikes her left temple. She spins and falls forward, her hands never leaving her sides. John later reflects that she might have been gone before she even hit the ground.
The speed, the force, that unusual sound of the bat, they all underscore the completely random and almost violent nature of the accident. And the fact that her hands never moved adds to the sense of suddenness, like it was just instantaneous.
The aftermath is just a blur of these surreal details. Mr. Chickering is the first one there. He lifts her head, turns her face, and then he does these things that are almost hard to comprehend. Like, he pulls down her skirt, pinches her knees together, and uses his warm-up jacket as a screen. John's view is blocked, and he remembers Mr. Chickering saying the strange thing about memory being a monster. And then, unbelievably, Chief Pike, the police chief, shows up and asks this question that seems so absurd in that moment. Where's the ball?
So it's like everyone's trying to process what just happened, but they're doing it in these strange ways. Mr. Chickering's actions, maybe he was trying to be respectful, but they come across as cold, detached. And his comment about memory, it foreshadows how John will struggle with this event for the rest of his life. And then Chief Pike's question, so focused on this insignificant detail, it just highlights the utter disorientation of grief.
It's like the world has shifted on its axis. And then a bit later, we're introduced to this game called Through the House.
Oh yeah, the game.
It's this elaborate, almost ritualistic race through the Wheelwright home, with all these obstacles along the way. May the maid, Uncle Alfred, Dan Needham, even family dog Firewater, they all seem to be in on it, and somehow John always ends up last. And the loser's prize is this forced kiss with Hester. He describes his cousins, Noah and Simon, having to physically restrain her, stop her from locking herself away, and then they tie her to her bed so he can kiss her.
I mean, it's described as a game, but it's got this really disturbing undercurrent, this forced interaction with Hester, the physical coercion involved. It raises questions about boundaries, consent, maybe even foreshadows some of the darker themes that will emerge later.
Definitely. And then we have the Thanksgiving visit of John's cousins. Owen's incredibly anxious about meeting Noah, Simon, and Hester. So anxious that he actually shows up a day early with, of all things, an armadillo. John admits he has these conflicting feelings. He wants his cousins to like Owen, but he also kind of hopes the visit is chaotic enough that they won't want to invite Owen back to their even wilder home, Sawyer Depot.
It makes sense, right? He can already see the potential clash between Owen's personality and the more rambunctious energy of his cousins.
Absolutely. And then we have the closet incident with Hester. I mean, what even was that? It's dark. Hester's hiding under a top coat draped with shoes, watching Owen upside down. She accidentally brushes his hair, starts tickling him, and Owen completely freaks out, wets his pants, and makes this super fast escape. And what's really odd is that the cousins, for once, don't tease him about it. They're just quiet.
It's one of those scenes that just stays with you. So strange and awkward. And Owen's reaction, it highlights his intense sensitivity, maybe even a discomfort with physical contact. And the cousins' silence, it's almost like they sense something's off, something they don't fully understand.
It's like a glimpse into something deeper, something about Owen that we don't quite grasp yet. Then we get a bit of insight into the courtship and marriage of John's mother and Dan Needham. Grandmother is hilariously impatient, making this analogy about people joining the priesthood faster. Dan and John's mother attend both congregational and Episcopal services.
It's like this religious dance they're doing.
Right, and the singing lessons John's mother used to take in Boston, they sort of fade out, which keeps alive the mystery of John's father. Grandmother's convinced it was the singing teacher, but Owen, ever blunt, dismisses that as too obvious.
Classic Owen. Always thinking outside the box, suggesting there's more to the story than meets the eye.
For sure. And their honeymoon departure, talk about memorable. A sudden hailstorm, Owen just happens to be there, gets a ride with the newlyweds, and then steals Hester's panties and aways them as they drive away.
Oh yeah, that was a weird one. Like, what was the meaning behind that? Was it just a prank? Or was there something more to it?
Honestly, it's anyone's guess. We meet Mr. Chickering again years later in the soldier's home. He has Alzheimer's, his memories are fragmented, he's often agitated, but every now and then he has these moments of clarity, and they always revolve around that baseball game. You're on deck, Johnny. Owen's batting for you, Johnny. You don't want to see her, Johnny.
It's heartbreaking, really. That day, that accident, it's clearly haunted him for years. You can feel the guilt, the responsibility he carries. It's no wonder the baseball team disbanded after that.
It's like the tragedy reverberated outward, touching everyone involved. There's another scene, quiet but really touching, where young Owen goes to John's mother's grave at night. Knowing she had a lifelong fear of the dark, he places a flashlight among the flowers, like little beacon of light for her.
It shows such depth of feeling, such empathy, even at that age. It speaks volumes about his connection to John's mother, how he understood her, even in death.
And then we have the dressmaker's dummy incident. It's so random. Owen, Hester, and John decide to move it from the dining room to Dan's dorm room. And Owen takes charge of the whole operation, worried about Dan being alone with it.
It's kind of comical, right? This strange anxiety over a dressmaker's dummy. But maybe it speaks to Owen's literary way of seeing things, or maybe it's symbolic of something deeper about relationships and loss.
There's always a deeper meaning with Owen, isn't there? And then we have the death of Sagamore, the family dog. It's this tragic, bizarre incident involving a diaper truck. Owen tries to shield the cat, Mr. Fish, but the dog doesn't make it. It's this awful smell, and the whole community comes together for this impromptu burial in grandmother's rose bushes. And Owen insists on putting Sagamore's belongings in the burlap sack. His tennis balls, his food dish, a blanket, even some bright maple leaves, but he stopped from adding the football.
It's like this ritualistic way of saying goodbye, honoring Sagamore's life. And the exclusion of the football, maybe it represents a recognition that some things are for the living.
That Christmas Eve at Waterhouse Hall, things take a decidedly awkward turn with the Brinkersmiths' very loud and very disruptive sexual activity. Young Owen is traumatized, saying it felt like he was underneath the Flying Yankee, and then he declares, "Sex makes people crazy."
It's a moment of lost innocence, right? He's confronted with this adult world, and it's confusing and kind of scary for him.
Absolutely. And after that, Morrison, the mailman, decides to quit his annual role as the Ghost of Christmas. Yet to come in the town play, he doesn't want to tell Dan, grandmother refuses, and then out of the blue, Owen says he knows about it.
It's another one of those moments where you get the sense Owen knows more than he lets on. Like he has this insight into things that others don't.
Definitely. The narrator then reflects on his tendency to dwell on the past, especially his memories of Canning Campbell. He mentions how Canning Campbell understood his anger at President Carter's pardon of draft dodgers, even though John was Canadian, and John's cynical question at the time, who will pardon the United States?
It shows how deeply those political events affected him, even as an outsider. It speaks to his sense of justice, maybe even a growing disillusionment with the political landscape.
And he has this really negative memory of a nativity play that kind of ruined Christmas for him. The kid playing Jesus just struck him as a born victim, and it left a bad taste in his mouth.
Interesting. Maybe it reflects his own discomfort with suffering, with the idea of a preordained fate, which obviously ties into Owen's story in a big way.
Yeah, I think so. Then there's the death of Lydia during another Christmas play, which is shrouded in this almost supernatural aura. Owen gets this sudden high fever, says something strange, and grandmother and Germaine are convinced he had a premonition. But Dan, always the pragmatist, says it was just Owen's imagination running wild.
It's another one of those moments where you're left wondering, is there something more to Owen? Does he have some kind of sixth sense?
Right. And then there's that really odd detail about closing Lydia's eyelids with coins and tape. It adds this creepy, ritualistic element to the scene.
Totally unsettling. And then we have the disappearance of the statue of Mary Magdalene from St. Michael's. Owen, who sees the school as a prison and fears nuns, is particularly aware of this statue in the otherwise deserted playground. And then one day, it's just gone.
Poof. Vanished.
And Dan even comments on how heavy it was, like it would have taken a lot of effort to move. Later, Owen explains its disappearance with two words: faith and prayer.
Cryptic, as always. And of course, the statue eventually turns up in this unexpected place on the stage of the Great Hall at Gravesend Academy. It's like this bold, almost rebellious act.
Very Owen. Challenging authority, making a statement.
Totally. John tries to talk to Aunt Martha about his father, a subject he's clearly still unsure about, but she avoids the topic, and he ends up saying that Dan is the best father.
It shows his loyalty to Dan, but also this lingering need to know about his biological father.
Right, it's still a bit of a mystery, and the impact of Owen Hester on the family is still felt years later. The cousins still talk about Owen's knowing, and they refer to Hester as Hester the Molested. Aunt Martha and Uncle Alfred are convinced Hester will come home for Christmas. John observes Owen's seriousness and Hester's anger, contrasting with his aunt and uncle's almost delusional happiness, and he mentions his own lack of success in dating.
It's like the ripple effects of their childhood, those early relationships. They continue to shape their lives in all these subtle ways.
Absolutely. John brings up President Reagan's Arms for Hostages program and the lies surrounding it. He remembers Owen's cynical view that Americans only care about things when they're directly affected through taxes, the draft, casualties. And Owen later comment that abolishing the draft would just make Americans even more apathetic about foreign affairs.
Owen was always insightful, even back then, seeing through the hypocrisy, pointing out the flaws in society.
For sure. During their freshman year at the University of New Hampshire, Owen and John being commuters actually gives them an edge over the dorm residents.
It sets them apart again, right? Not fully immersed in that typical college life.
Right. Owen's summer job at the Meany Granite Company shows him taking on a lot of responsibility. His dad isn't the best businessman, and Owen steps up. He even offers to teach John about the derrick and dynamite.
Owen always willing to share his knowledge, even when it involves potential dangerous things.
And then there's that amazing story of Owen dunking a basketball. He claims he did it in under 3 seconds, obsessing over the timing. They practice at the rundown St. Michael's playground, and Owen says he can feel when they hit the right time. The nuns watch, and the statue of Mary Magdalene offers silent encouragement.
It's like this mystical quest, almost. This connection Owen has to something beyond the physical.
Totally. John has a pretty jaded view of the 60s, calling them ardent simpletons and mystical muddiness. He says there was a lack of irony except for Owen and the Beatles, and he connects this to Hester's failed singing career as Hester Eastman and her later success as Hester the Molester.
It's interesting how he sees that connection, right? The shift in cultural values, the appeal of the shocking or controversial.
Right. And now, living as a teacher in Toronto, John's students are fascinated by his connection to Hester the Molester.
Her notoriety follows him, even all these years later.
After Owen's death, John visits the Meany house and learns something really disturbing, that Mr. and Mrs. Meany told Owen about his virgin birth right around the time he hit the baseball that killed John's mother. John's angry, feels like Owen was used. He takes some of Owen's things, but leaves the dressmaker's dummy behind.
Wow, that's a huge revelation. It adds this whole other layer to Owen's story, his sense of destiny.
Right, it makes you question everything. John goes back to the monument shop with Mr. Meany and remembers Owen working there. He recalls his own discomfort after using his index finger as a kid. And then Mr. Meany shows him a gravestone with an inscription Owen carved himself. Owen Meany has hit the mark.
It's a powerful image, isn't it? This sense of completion, even in death.
It really makes you think. John wrestles with questions of faith, destiny, how Owen could have known the things he did. And he needs us with this warning. Watch out for people who call themselves religious.
It's a warning to be discerning, to look beyond surface appearances.
Definitely. We see the Vietnam moratorium in Gravesend, church bells ringing, services, a parade, a peaceful demonstration, and then the contrasting views of the local newspaper and the more liberal grave. And Mr. Morrison, in a surprising move, stages his own counter-demonstration with a North Vietnamese flag.
It shows the complexities of the time, the range of opinions, even within this small community.
Absolutely. And finally, we have John's diary entries, glimpses into his unexciting life compared to Owen's. He mentions the Bishop Strachan greenhouse burning down and the singing of Sons of God.
It highlights the difference of their paths, but also John's continued fascination with Owen's life.
So in these early chapters of A Prayer for Owen Meany, we see Owen as this extraordinary, enigmatic figure, forever linked to the narrator John Wheelwright, whose life is forever altered by that tragic baseball accident. We meet a cast of colorful characters, and Irving lays the groundwork for the major themes that will unfold: faith, destiny, the randomness of life, the consequences of our actions.
And for you, our listener, we want to leave you with this thought. How do these early experiences, these seemingly insignificant moments, shape who Owen becomes and what he ultimately achieves? What is the meaning of that inscription on his tombstone?
Owen Meany has hit the mark. What was that mark? And how does John Irving use these seemingly disparate threads to weave this incredible tapestry of a novel? We hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought and sparked your curiosity to explore A Prayer for Owen Meany further.
It's a book that rewards multiple readings, for sure. There's always something new to uncover. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for being here.